Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ102, Introduction to Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice Online. Tonight, we are going to be doing the Chapter 3 lecture covering crime in the United States, offenses, offenders, and victims. A couple things of note before we get started. Don't forget to take the time again to look at the key terms that you will find at the beginning of each chapter. And also look at the discussion questions at the end of the chapter and see how well perhaps you can answer those, because these things will really, again, help you to prepare for those weekly quizzes and ultimately your chapter exams. So for sake of time, as I've done in the other chapters, I'm going to skip over the learning objectives because I'm going to have you read those, and we'll just kind of jump into our chapter discussion for this evening. So to anyone who excuse me, watches television, reads a newspaper, or checks their daily news feed on social media, because that's what you do, right? Everyone out there, I'm really hoping that you read the paper, either the print version, if that's your thing, or online, so you really know what's going on around you. Specifically in the community that you live, in the community that you might work in. So to anyone who watches television, reads a newspaper, or checks their daily news feed on social media, hardly a day goes by that there is not some mention of crime or victimization that kind of comes out. And even when you look online, you can see all of the headlines that are there, and they say things from guilty plea for man who wanted to join ISIS with his girlfriend, to police hunt for 2 gunmen behind PA ambush that killed 6, or driver in fatal Vegas Strip crash going to mental hospital. And the headlines are just packed with different things that are out there. And crime in the daily news has really become as kind of basic as the weather report. It's just we see it all the time. So the question really comes to mind, how much crime is there? Is crime really up or down? And how do we know that? And what are the sources? Where can we find good sources to tell us that crime is up or down? Or a step further, what is the public's perception of crime? Because those are going to be different things. You're going to hear a phrase later on called the fear of crime, and that's the perception that your community members have about crime in your community. And it's that fear of crime. And just because maybe your crime rate isn't up, but if people are out there afraid and don't come out of their houses, and this and that, then there's that fear of crime concept, and there are things that contribute to that. What I've posted here is a link that you can look at where a reporter basically goes out and asks the general public about, do you believe crime is up or down? And you can hear different responses from different people. So take a minute to look at that, if you would. I think it would really add some context to what we're talking about today. And what do you think? Do you think crime is really up or down? Up or down? So, kind of as an introduction, the 10-episode Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer, which took a decade to film and premiered in December of 2015, captured viewers' attention worldwide and elicited strong public opinion with that. And the series, if you don't know, followed the story of Stephen Avery, a Wisconsin man who spent 18 years in prison for a rape and an attempted murder before DNA evidence exonerated him. Now, before I go any further, and I think if you know me by now, and some of you do, and this might be some of you for the first time you're taking one of my classes, I don't defend law enforcement and I don't attack law enforcement. Okay, I'm kind of down the middle because I've seen all the different aspects of policing over 34 years. So I understand the nuances of policing and perception and the public and everything that goes along with this. But one thing I want to kind of put out there to you is that you have to think of some of these stories in their proper context. And that's kind of why I'm leading with this particular story. Yes, you're going to hear, hey, this person spent this much time wrongfully convicted, and then DNA evidence cleared them. Well, first of all, that's great that DNA evidence cleared them, but think back 30 years ago. Did we have the same processes to process DNA the way that we do now? Could we even collect it or process it in a manner that we do now compared to 30 years ago? The answer is going to be no. So if you couldn't use DNA evidence back then, you relied on other evidence, whether it's direct evidence, whether photos or video or whatever else that was used, along with perhaps witness statements and circumstantial evidence and everything else that kind of goes into a trial. And we'll talk about trials later on in a future chapter. And the people that convict or acquit somebody, it's not the officer, it's not the DA's office, it's a jury of their peers. In California, it would be 12 people. In other places, it might be 9. So when you talk about this, make sure you don't arbitrarily use the fact that somebody was wrongfully convicted. If it was, and people that sometimes make bad IDs, they don't do it on purpose. It's just not a good identification. And all the jury can really do is take into account all of the evidence that they get and make the best decision that they can. So I want to lead in with that before we get into this. And again, I'm not saying, hey, it's great that some guy was convicted of something and then later found that it wasn't him. I think that's horrible. But you have to put everything into context before you arbitrarily just kind of step out with a statement, hey, they wrongfully convicted him. Well, hey, maybe there wasn't enough evidence at the time to the level of evidence that there might be now. So stepping down off the high horse for a moment. So again, the series follows the story of Stephen Avery, a Wisconsin man who spent 18 years in prison for a rape and attempted murder before DNA evidence ended up exonerating him. Now, he was released in 2003 and filed a $36 million lawsuit. Well, in 2005, he was arrested again and charged with murder, along with his 16-year-old nephew, and both were convicted. While the show is a bit one-sided for the defense, it does raise questions regarding victims, offenders, and the offenses that bring them together. And that's kind of why I'm using this analogy as we go into this chapter and talk about crime and talk about victims and things like that. So crime involves hurtful acts committed by individuals against other individuals or their property. Now, until recently, crimes have been examined as acts against the state and prosecuted similarly the same way. The system is beginning to view criminals, victims, and society as all equally affected by criminal acts. Now, that's a pretty bold statement to make because you might have some varying opinions on this, and this can be one of those chapters where people can get a little bit emotional about their opinions when you talk about this particular subject. And look at that sentence again. The system is beginning to view criminals, victims, and society as all equally affected. That's a bold statement because some people are going to say, you know what, I don't view the criminal anywhere in there as equally affected. They're the ones that shot and killed somebody. They're the ones that did whatever act it was. So again, context as we start to kind of go through this and have some discussions. Now, where do we get some of this information about crime, because it has to come from somewhere, right? So for criminal justice professionals, the most authoritative sources of information about crime in the United States are those that we call official sources. And sometimes even those sources aren't without problems. Now, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, asserts that information is the true currency of our modern age. And the collection of data and information is not only useful in decision making and planning, but it is also vital to solving crime-related problems in today's society. And they also talk about several sources of information about crime are available. But again, for criminal justice professionals, the most authoritative sources of information about crime are those that we deem to be official, but even those sources can have a little bit of issue. So some official sources that are out there can be the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports and the National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBARS for short. The Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey. And you'll see I put a little note down there that these are the two most frequently consulted sources out of all of these other sources here that we're looking at. And then there's self-report surveys that law enforcement will actually self-report, if you will, and then the media. So let's first look at the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. So information about crimes comes from statistics gathered around the country. Now, in 1930, Congress assigned the FBI to serve as the national clearinghouse, a place where all of these stats go for crime statistics. The FBI's National Crime Information Center, which is NCIC for short, came up with a program, instituted a program called the Uniformed Crime Report, or reports. And they call that the UCR for short. And you'll see that UCR acronym kind of come up a few times. Now, the UCR, or that Uniform Crime Report, collects data from what we call Part 1 offenses. And Part 1 offenses include things like murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, burglary, larceny or theft, and motor vehicle theft. And then in 1978, they added arson. Now, these are what they call crimes against persons, which are violent crimes, and property crimes. And you can see there's a lot more types of crimes out there. And some of those are considered like Part 2 crimes and miscellaneous and things like that. But this UCR tracks what, I guess a good way to put it is, the bigger crimes, the higher level crimes, those ones that are categorically broad. So murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Those are the four that are on the crimes against persons side, or the violent crime side. And then burglary, larceny, and theft, motor vehicle theft, and then arson, like I said before, that was added in 1978 as those property crimes. So hopefully this all kind of makes sense right now, but we'll get into it a little bit more. And again, the UCR does track other crimes, but these are the bigger ones that are out there. Well, what about those like self-reported surveys that we kind of talked about? Well, studies used by sociologists and criminologists to determine the extent of crime and deviance. So we do have studies that are out there and surveys that are out there that talk about or try to figure out the extent of crime and deviance. And it might be through sociologists, it might be through criminologists, or it might be from local police departments to their communities. Or it might be larger studies that are done, say, by the Police Executive Research Forum which is a group located in Washington, D.C. that helps law enforcement agencies on a variety of different levels and deals with a lot of different issues related to policing. And they might do a study of crime on gang members or something, and they'll send surveys out to other departments and things like that to try to get information on whether they believe, let's say, gang crimes are up in communities. So that's one other way to get it. And then the media, well, much of what the public knows about crime comes from the media, which honestly sometimes may over dramatize and distort the true extent and the seriousness of the overall problem when it comes to crime. Now, much of what the public knows about crime comes from the media because that's what they see every day. And again, kind of what I said just a minute ago, sometimes they do tend to over dramatize or distort the true extent and seriousness of the problem. Now, there's a phrase out there in the media world that we kind of throw out, and you may not like it, but it is what it is. And it goes like this: if it bleeds, it needs, meaning that if it bleeds, people are going to want to see it. People don't watch the news typically for all the good, warm, fuzzy stories that are on there, because that's not what the media typically throws out in front to grab your attention at 6 o'clock or at 5 o'clock or at 4 o'clock or at 9 o'clock or whenever the news comes on. It's usually something that's big, something that's exciting, something that's dangerous, something that grabs your attention. And law enforcement, public safety, all of that stuff, major incidents, those are things that lead a lot of the news stories. So hopefully you kind of you can get where I'm coming from when I'm talking about the media. So continuing with the media, the basic unavoidable conflict here is that the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects the media in reporting, basically protecting the public's right to know. So the media says, hey, you know what? The public has a right to know this, so we need this information. Well, law enforcement, on the other hand, must protect the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, where a defendant is entitled to a fair trial, which includes maintaining investigative integrity. Now, think about this on a grand scale. Think about a big, huge trial that had so much press attention that people actually had decided on whether somebody was guilty or innocent before it even went to trial. Now, that makes it very difficult for not only law enforcement, but the judicial system to actually make a fair trial out of this. So this is kind of the conflict that is there between the media and the police. But now it's not always bad, because both of these entities have what we call a symbiotic relationship, which means that they need each other. The media needs law enforcement and public safety to provide them with information, timely information if possible, on issues where they believe it's the public's right to know, like, crimes and arrests and all that cool stuff, and car chases and shootings and you name it. Well, law enforcement and they get that information from us. Now, law enforcement in turn sometimes needs the media to help get information out. Missing persons, critical missing people, kidnappings, looking for murder suspects, all of that kind of stuff, and the media helps us as well. So while we have that relationship where we need each other, there still is a little bit of a conflict in between these two entities, because they're, at the end of the day, their priorities are just a little bit different, sort of. So despite this inherent constitutionally based conflict, a police-media partnership benefits the common goal of public safety, because at the end of the day, yes, they do have a common goal in benefiting public safety. And that is definitely true. So where do we find some of this information? Now, I'm not sure this is going to work, but I'm gonna give it a shot here, and I'm gonna click on this and see if it actually will kind of work while we're going through this presentation. And let's see if it'll do it. Okay, so it did. So now we are on the FBI's, so the Federal Bureau of Investigation's UCR, or Uniform Crime Reporting website. And you can go there, which is why I put that link in here. And if you look at what I have here, it talks about crime in the United States. And this is an annual publication for more than 8 decades. And this report contains a compilation of the volume and rate of violent and property crimes and offenses for the nation and by state. And you can even get individual law enforcement data. So I'm not going to go into everything, but you can look at hate crime statistics, law enforcement officers killed and assaulted, and then some miscellaneous sections. But let's just go to the preliminary thing for 2016. And here's a good picture of, this is crime in the United States for the first 6 months of 2016. And it will go down and it will tell you, and you can get the little charts and stuff from over here. This is more of just kind of a text version of what it is, but all the charts are here. But I wanted you to be able to see that so you understood where we can find a good source on crime, if you will. Now let me see if I can get out of this. Look at me. I feel like I've done a heck of a job doing that. So here's the website, here's the link, and this again is one place that you can go to find information about crime. Now, our first little discussion question will be, well, why are crimes underreported? Is this a reporting of crimes a good or bad characteristics of a community? Well, every law enforcement agency is in fact required to report their crimes to the UCR, but the question is, are all of those crimes getting reported? And if they're not, why are they not getting reported? And are there some types of crimes that people may not report? Are there certain groups that don't like to report certain types of crimes? And these are all questions that we really have to kind of ask ourselves as we look at classifications, definitions, and victimization of crime. So as an added bonus here, I kind of wanted to show you what they call, that is a crime clock. And here is kind of a very quick way, but a very shocking way actually, to look at crime across the United States. Now, the slide you have before you is violent and property crimes, and you know, there are some that are excluded from the UCR. Remember, we talked about that. There are misdemeanors, you know, and felonies that are excluded, but we're just talking about the ones here. But it tells you in a very unique perspective how often these types of crimes occur. And honestly, I think you will be a little bit shocked when you do it. So let me see if I did this. So here's 2013's crime clock. And we're going to walk through a couple of years and see if crime has maybe gone up or down. So a violent crime listed down below here, on the average, occurs every 27.1 seconds in the United States. There's a murder every 37 minutes across the United States. Are you shocked yet? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. I don't know. There's a rape every 6.6 minutes. There's a robbery every 1.5 minutes. There's an aggravated assault every 43.5 seconds. There's a burglary every 16.4 seconds. Holy smokes. There's a larceny theft every 5.3 seconds. There's a motor vehicle theft every 45.1 seconds. That's kind of crazy. So what about 2014? Pretty much about the same. So the average violent crime was 26.3 and it was 27.1. So it increased a little bit. What about 2015? And kind of look at it. So a violent crime has occurred across the United States consisting of one of these four below every 26.3 seconds. Wow. I don't know. I mean, again, it even surprises me sometimes when you look at the level of crime that's out there, and where it comes from, and just how often it really occurs. So the crime clock, though, well, before we get there, well, let me just go ahead. The crime clock, when we go back, so when we look at this crime clock, should be viewed with a little bit of care. Okay, now the most aggregate representation of uniform crime report data, it conveys the annual reported crime experience by showing a relative frequency of occurrence of Part 1 crimes. It really should not be taken to imply a regularity in the commission of crime, but it is based on data. So the crime clock represents the annual ratio of crime to fixed intervals. So when you add up all of the crimes that are reported from all of the states and then you average them out, this is how you get the fact that these occur in the time segments as listed. So we can't really say for certain that there's a murder every 33.5 minutes, but when you average them all together, that's the number that you come up with. So it could be longer on one end and shorter on the other end, if that makes any sense. So I also wanted to show you a slide on how a local agency might break down crime, because remember, law enforcement agencies report these types of crimes to the UCR. So what I did is I took a slide basically from the City of Rialto Police Department and I'm showing you the difference in levels of crime, okay, what we reported to the UCR between the years 2012 and 2014. And I'll let you be the judge of whether you think that we were doing okay or not. And the crimes that are on the left, murder, rape, robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, theft, arson, remember, those are the UCR crimes that are reported. And if you look on page 87 to page 89, I'm sorry, to page 90 in your textbook, you will see a bunch of different definitions that if we have time we'll go over, but more than likely I'll have you go through those, and they are the same definitions up here. So if you want to know what murder is, you can go and look up that particular charge, because I'm more concerned with not actually what the offense is, but to show you how the offenses are reported, at least right now. So in 2012, you can look at that top row, and that would be all the bars in red that are on the chart. There were 4 homicides, 17 rapes, 201 robberies, 287 aggravated assaults, 898 burglaries, 1,798 larcenies, 875 motor vehicle thefts, and 17 arsons. Now, if you look at 2013, you can start to compare the difference, and let's look to see if we have any crime going down. Well, you do a little bit in robbery, so you have the same amount of homicides, a couple more rapes, a little drop in robbery, a pretty good drop in aggravated assault, a decent sized drop in burglary, actually a huge drop in larceny or theft, and a drop in motor vehicle theft. But then we had a couple of more arsons. Now you go to 2014, and you can see we had one more homicide. Rapes are about the same, but we had a significant decrease in robberies. We had a further decrease in aggravated assaults. We had a big decrease in burglaries and in thefts, a huge decrease in larcenies, and a big decrease in motor vehicle theft, and then a huge decrease in arsons. Now, during that time, you know, there are some crimes that you can actually work hard to prevent. You can't prevent drive-bys. I mean, you can do some things. You can't always prevent rapes, and you can't always be there to prevent robberies. You can educate individuals on how to defend themselves and how not to be victims and this and that, which might explain some drops in some of the person crimes. But there are programs in place that you can educate people on and do a better job internally on dealing with things like burglary and theft and motor vehicle theft. And I think that you can see that those programs that we had in place had a significant impact, to the point of a 24% drop in violent crime and about a 20% drop in property crime compared to the previous years. And that's actually pretty good. But this is what we would do at the local level. So I wanted you to be able to see that and actually understand what it is. Now, we might have time, so I'll walk through these quickly. So if you're following along on page 87, because I know you are, because you're super duper diligent folks, homicide, the killing of one human being by another. Now, it's kind of a shortened definition, but you know, it'll do. Murder, the willful, non-negligent killing of one human by another, a form of homicide. Rape is there. Well, you know what? We're not going to have a lot of time to go through them all. I just think it's probably better that you take the time to go through and look at each one of those on their own, and it'll just probably make things easier. Well, some other crime categories that I think are of worth mentioning would be what we would call white-collar crime. And this is occupational or business-related crime. And it's also referred to as economic crimes. And the term white-collar crime was reportedly coined in 1939 by American sociologist and criminologist Edwin Sutherland, and pretty much has become synonymous with the full range of frauds committed by businesses and government professionals, offenses in which a violation or abuse of trust has occurred. So, you know, white-collar crime includes things like credit card and check fraud, identity theft, security theft and fraud, insurance fraud, consumer fraud, deceptive practices, bankruptcy fraud, embezzlement, bribes and kickbacks and payoffs and money laundering, receiving stolen property, and things like that. Now, there's one super famous case that you may want to kind of look up. It's actually pretty cool, considering the amount of money that's involved. And that would be the Bernie Madoff case. And that is one of the largest economic cases that have kind of come out. And that's really where the FBI was able to assist on this particular case and bring this person into custody. But that's just a huge case. And then they have something called cybercrime, which is part of the larger category of computer crimes, or what they call cyber technology. So, you know, technology has revolutionized crime by adding an element of anonymity and removing the need for physical proximity when you think about it, because you can commit crimes over the computer. So computers and other technology now allow offenders to gain access to victims wherever they go online, and can be used to violate restraining orders, harassment orders, and other orders for protection in which contact between an offender and victim is legally prohibited. And social media and technology have enabled bullying to transcend the traditional schoolyard venue and basically reach into a victim's home or wherever they log on to use their cell phones. And most big corporations have been victims of computer-related crime, from employees snooping through confidential files to criminals stealing trade secrets and customer information. Now, the most common crimes are credit card fraud, telecommunications fraud, unauthorized access to confidential files, and unlawful copying of copyrighted or licensed software. And although a large portion of cybercrime, which is computer crime, is committed internally by employees, companies and private users are finding themselves increasingly vulnerable to outside hackers. And compounding that challenge is the fact that much computer crime goes unreported. So, I mean, just interesting. So cybercrime is part of that larger category of computer crime. And along with cybercrime is one of the country's fastest growing crimes, which is identity theft, which is an offense where someone wrongfully obtains and uses another's personal data in some way that involves fraud or deception, usually and most often for economic gain. Now, identity theft became a federal crime in the United States in 1998 with the passage of the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act. Identity theft was once classified under the FBI's financial crime section, but is now generally handled within that cybercrime section. And identity theft can be both a high and a low-level crime, meaning that offenders can intercept mail with personal identifying information on it, such as social security numbers, bank account numbers, and such. Waiters, retail clerks, gas station attendants, and other service personnel can steal credit and debit card numbers, either manually or by a thing called skimming, which is using a small portable device that copies and stores data from your credit card. And at ATM machines, a skimmer can be inserted into the slot where the customer inserts their actual card, and the device is virtually undetectable and can allow the offender to drain a victim's bank account after the victim has completed his or her transaction and has left the scene. So that's kind of a scary thing when you think about it. And then there's organized crime. And you're wondering, can crime really be organized? Well, yeah. The basic definition of organized crime is a continuing criminal conspiracy seeking high profits with an organized structure that uses fear and corruption. Now, the FBI's organized crime program's mission is to eliminate criminal enterprises that pose the greatest threat to American society. And to accomplish this mission, the FBI has the following units under their umbrella basically to help. So it would be the LCN, or the Italian Organized Crime Unit, the Labor Racketeering Unit, the Euro-Asian Organized Crime Unit, and the Asian African Criminal Enterprise Unit. And there's a lot of other units that are in there that deal with a lot of different things. Those are just a couple of them that I wanted to kind of mention. And along with those, before we jump into another category called hate crime, I want to give you a couple of other definitions that fall under kind of those fraud sections that are out there, like skimming, like we talked about. There's a term out there called, they call it phishing, and and it's spelled funny. It's P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G, and it's a form of internet fraud, and it's that's also called spoofing. And spoofing uses technology to misrepresent a criminal and mask his or her true identity from others in an attempt to acquire personal or financial gain. So it's also called phishing. So either one of those definitions would be appropriate. Now, another category or crime category, and we saw this when we looked up the UCR because this is something that is actually tracked, would be hate crimes. Now, the FBI defines a bias crime or hate crime as a criminal offense committed against a person, property, or society motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or ethnic or national origin. Now, a hate crime is a criminal offense committed against a person, property, or society motivated in whole or part by the offender's bias against race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or ethnic or national origin. Now, ritualistic crime in this particular category is the unlawful act committed during a ceremony related to a belief system. The crime, not the belief system, is the part that needs to be investigated. And before we kind of move forward on that, I want to bring a term forward so you understand a little bit more on what it means, and that would be the term xenophobia. Now, we know that hate is divided into two general categories. Okay, it's rational and irrational, or maybe you didn't know that, but you do now. Unjust acts may cause rational hate. Hate based on a person's race, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or national origin, whether actual or merely perceived by the offender as such, constitutes irrational hate. Hate crimes may also be seen in a form of what they call xenophobia, and that is the fear and hatred of strangers or foreigners. Now, remember I told you that we track in the UCR hate crimes. All law enforcement agencies are required to report all of their hate crimes as well. Now, FBI statistics report 5,479 criminal incidents involving 6,418 offenses resulting from bias or hate in 2014. Now, race was the most frequent motivation of hate crime offenses at about 47% of the numbers that I just gave you. So, as we start to move on, and we're going to talk about some theories of crimes and things like that, I wanted to bring up one interesting theory or concept as we start to move through this. Remember when I talked about the fact that you can't always depend on the numbers and that are reported, and sometimes the numbers may not be accurate, and that sometimes even what we call those sources that give us the information, even though they're the ones that we want, those professional sources, they still come with problems sometimes. So we have this term out there called the dark figure of crime, and basically you need to be mindful of several limitations present when interpreting crime data. Now, official statistics only reflect reported crimes, and these are voluntary, and they vary in accuracy and completeness. And furthermore, it is estimated that less than half of the crimes committed are reported to police. Now, I don't know if that's true, whether it's actually only half, but even if it's just a quarter, 25%, that could really skew the data. And there are, again, a lot of reasons why people may not want to report crimes. And if I can make it through this lecture in under 60 minutes, I'll try to remind myself to come back and talk to you about a reason something can backfire when you talk about crime reporting. So I'll see if I can get to that. So this true number of crimes is also called the dark figure of crime because it's kind of unknown. And it's the iceberg analogy where you know what's on top, you know what's been reported because you can see it because you have the numbers. But you don't know what's on the bottom. You don't know how much is there or how much is not there because you don't know how many people have actually reported and how accurate all of that reporting could be. So our second discussion question, what is the difference between reasonable fear and the sort of fear that inspires a hate crime? And why is the prevention of hate crime particularly difficult? So just think about these discussion questions as we kind of go through. We won't have a lot of time to spend on them because we do have so much information that we have to kind of cover. So now that we know what crimes are in a sense and how we report them and how some are categorized, let's look at some theories of criminality. And there's some major theories out there, and the two biggest ones would be the classical theory and the positive or the positivist theory. Sorry. Why people commit crime has been debated since crime was first defined. And some blame crime on the failings of the criminal justice system, understaffed police forces, lenient judges, overcrowded jails and prisons, and overworked or burnt out probation or parole officers. And others blame society and the overwhelming absence of personal and community responsibility and accountability, which I'm kind of with them on in a sense. Abusive or permissive parents, inadequate schools, sometimes even incompetent teachers, not me of course, the decline of religion, media violence, drugs, and high rates of unemployment. And there's a detailed discussion on both of these different theories in the book, but we're just going to kind of touch on some of these so you know kind of what they are. So again, classical, positivist. So theories of criminality and causes of crime. The classical theory developed by Italian criminologist Cesare Bassaria and says that people are rational and responsible for their own acts. And the classical theory sees people as free agents with free will. And people commit crimes, you know why? Because they want to. And, you know, that could be okay. I totally understand that. In that framework, though, in that classical theory, I want to touch on something really quick that and that's where I flipped ahead and kind of flipped back. In that classical theory, there was a refinement of this classical theory later on that's called the routine activities theory. And it was developed by Lawrence Cohen and Marcus Felsen. And they state that the volume and distribution of predatory crime, okay, those in which an offender tries to steal an object directly, correlates with three different variables found in American life. And the first one is the availability of a suitable target. The second one is the absence of a watchful guardian. And the third increment is the presence of motivated offenders. So take a look at that if you get a chance. But for today's lecture, know that the classical theory sees people as free agents with free will, and they commit crimes because you know what? That's what they want to do. Now, the positivist theory developed by Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso says there is a biological causation for deviant behavior. Okay, so it's not necessarily because they want to that there is some type of biological causation for deviant behavior. And the positivist theory sees criminals as victims of society and of their own biological, sociological, cultural, and physical environments. Now, I'm not sure what you think of that, but at the same time, you can kind of, well, I'll let you make your own kind of determination on that, on whether or not you believe outside influence really kind of impacts the criminality and things like that. And we already kind of went over this theory of criminality. I'm sorry, I didn't know that I actually put a slide in there, but we talked about the routine activities theory that was developed by Cohen and Felsen, which talks about the volume and distribution of predatory crime, and it's based on certain variables like the availability of targets, meaning in essence like home stores containing easily sold goods, or watchful guardians, meaning homeowners, neighbors, friends, relatives, guards, security systems, and things like that. And then motivated offenders, meaning like, unemployed folks, maybe drug abusers. And you can see how this might actually be true, because if you are a drug offender, you're going to look for a target where there might be easier to steal something and the absence of watchful guardians versus the other. So I could totally see how that plays into that. So back to the major theories that we talked about, and we talked about one of the positivist theory that had that biological kind of dimension in there. So the influence of biology, and we'll look at a couple of different models here. So a medieval law, so kind of get this. So this is a long debated question. Are criminals born or are they made? And if you look back at the influence of biology, a medieval law states that if two persons fall under suspicion of a crime, the uglier or more deformed is to be regarded more probably guilty. Now, such a law is based on the belief that criminals are born, not made. Although we've come a long way in our understanding of the causes of crime since the Middle Ages, a person's biological makeup continues to be among factors many believe are correlated with criminality. And biological functions and conditions that have been related to criminal behavior include variables like brain tumors, or limbic system disorders, or chromosomal abnormalities, or some type of neurologic dysfunction. And all of these are tied to some of these biological theories, which kind of leads us into the next part here, the influence of the environment. Can that really play a role in theories of criminality? Now, poverty, unemployment, drug and alcohol abuse. And I think that to a certain extent it can. So many environmental factors have been identified as contributing to criminality, including things like poverty and unemployment and disintegrating family and drug and alcohol abuse. And poverty is a pervasive, persistent, devastating threat to many of our nation's families, particularly to youths. Poverty encompasses a host of problems, including overcrowded and unhealthy living conditions, unsafe, crime-ridden neighborhoods, inadequate schools, limited access to health care, and single parenthood. Unemployment can be linked to poverty. Numerous studies suggest that a booming economy leads to decreased levels of unemployment, alleviating poverty, and maybe translating into a drop in crime. And the family is another strong environmental influence on criminal activity. As mentioned, the Census Bureau has identified unwed mothers and single-parent families as two risks to children's welfare. And sadly, many families serve as the training ground for violent behavior, perpetuating what has been termed the cycle of violence. And this isn't a class on violence, but we're talking about theory and the rationale and the reason for why crimes tend to be committed. And then on top of all of this, we have the possibility, well, what about the combination of biology and environment? Comparisons of groups of criminals with groups of non-criminals have failed to produce any single characteristic that absolutely distinguishes the two groups. However, a growing body of evidence suggests that the forces operating to stimulate criminal behavior may be a complex interaction between predisposing biological or genetic factors and certain environmental agents that trigger criminal tendencies. Thus, in the nature versus nurture debate, it is likely that criminal behavior is the result of both heredity and life experiences. Now, you may agree with some of this and you may not agree with some of it, but I just want you to have the information so you know that, hey, there's all these different types of crime theories out there. And, you know, if somebody could actually figure out what causes crime directly, we would all be a lot better off. But we know that some of these theories actually have some pretty decent ideas, and some of them are kind of like maybe not as accurate as we really think that they should be. Well, now, what about offenders? And let's try to move on, because we do have a little bit more ground that we have to cover in order to get done. Well, when we talk about offenders, we're going to look at career criminals first, or what they call recidivists. And a recidivist is one who habitually breaks the law. According to the FBI 2014 report, nearly 3/4, or about 73% of persons arrested in the United States during 2014 were male. Males accounted for 79.8% of those arrested for violent crime and 61.8% of those for property crime. The majority of those arrested in 2014 were white at 69.4%, 27.8% were black, and the remaining 2.8% were of other races. The highest number of arrests in 2014 were for drug offenses, followed by larceny, theft, and driving under the influence. Now, arrest data can indicate that the most typical offender in the United States is a white man younger than 30 years of age arrested for a nonviolent offense, but we know again that sometimes data isn't always 100% accurate. And we're starting off now talking about a recidivist, one who habitually breaks the law. So one major concern for law enforcement and the courts are the chronic or career criminals, a small group of offenders arrested multiple times. And such an offender is called, again, a recidivist. And although most of these offenders tend to age out and eventually turn from crime, a lot of them do not. So we have to kind of understand that as well. Traditional programs aimed at rehabilitation have been found to have really little effect on these recidivist type individuals. And some refer to our criminal justice system as kind of like a revolving door, because criminals are getting out of prison faster than the authorities can convict and incarcerate others. So it's kind of like this big revolving door where people are kind of coming in and out. Well, what about juveniles? How does it kind of relate to juveniles? Well, in addition to targeting career criminals, the criminal justice system has to focus on juveniles and deal with things like delinquency, which are actions or conduct by a person not of legal age that violate a local, state, or federal law, or status offenses, which are crimes restricted to persons under the legal age, for example, like smoking and drinking and curfew and truancy and incorrigibility. Now, same as adults, there are sometimes recidivists that are juveniles that keep coming back into the system, and that's the serious and violent juveniles, what we call maybe the 8%ers. Now, a study was done in Orange County. The Orange County, California Probation Department tracked a small group of first-time offenders for 3 years and found that a very small percentage of them, about 8%, were arrested repeatedly over that 3-year period. But they were also responsible for about 55% of all repeat cases and crimes. So, I mean, it's this 8% group is a group of repeat offenders dramatically different from those who are arrested only once. And this 8% accounts for a disproportionate amount of all of the youth crime. So the characteristics of this group of repeat offenders, again, were dramatically different from those who were just arrested once. And now we're gonna finish up with victims. And victims are typically kind of the overlooked area here. Everyone expects law enforcement officers to know how to deal with criminals. Of equal importance, however, would be the officer's ability to deal with crime victims. This not only enhances the image of police officers as professionals, but also enhances communications that likely will result in the officer's ability to obtain more crime-related information. And crime victims are often said to be the overlooked element of the criminal justice process, almost invisible and sometimes forgotten. And there's a couple of different types of victims. There's direct or primary victims, and there's indirect or secondary victims. Now, direct victims are those who are initially harmed by injury, death, or loss of property as a result of crimes committed. And primary victims are individuals directly affected by an incident, such as the person who was robbed, burglarized, or raped. So that would be direct victims and primary victims. And then indirect victims are family members and friends of victims who also feel pain and suffering along with the victim. And the secondary victims would be the family members and friends of victims who also feel pain and suffering along with the victim. So they're kind of interchangeable, but you can see the difference. So when you ask maybe, is crime just, is it just dealing with the criminal? Maybe we can say no now because we know that there are other victims other than maybe just the victim. What about the victim's family and everything else? What about victimization factors? What factors play into maybe you being a victim? Well, distinct demographic and individual characteristics are called risk factors, and those influence the chance of being victimized. Now, the degree of risk people face is affected by household factors related to how and where they live, as well as by individual factors. Now, some individual risk factors, we've got some data that was collected from NCVS that indicate certain individuals are at greater risk than others. And age would have one thing to do with it. Generally, for every crime measured by the NCVS, persons aged 12 to 24 years had the highest rate of victimization, and 50 or older had the lowest rate. Gender, males experience the highest rate of victimization than females in all violent crimes except rape or sexual assault. And then race, blacks experienced a higher violent victimization rate than whites or Hispanic, but the highest victimization rates overall were experienced by those who identified themselves as being two or more races. And some other factors in victimization beyond statistics do come into play. So beyond statistics, several other factors enter into understanding victimization, including the relationship between the victim and the offender, the use of the weapon, how the victims protected themselves or in fact attempted to do so. And then there's, fear and effects of victimization. Well, when somebody's victimized, what happens after that? Well, public opinion polls show that although people do fear crime in general, they usually believe their own neighborhoods are relatively safe. If someone in the neighborhood is victimized, however, the entire neighborhood may feel much more vulnerable. Now, the people with the highest risk of being victimized, young males, do not express the greatest fear of victimization. Those who express the greatest fear of victimization are women and elderly individuals, even though they are the lowest group or at-risk group compared to the others. Whether they are at low risk because they take measures to reduce their chances of being victimized or whatever really hasn't been explained by any type of research. And then dealing with crime victims, there's this phrase out there called the second wound, which might be what they call further victimization by the criminal justice system because perhaps they haven't done what they need to do to the fullest extent. Okay, so while feeling the impact of being victimized, many victims are subjected to a second victimization as a result of insensitivity shown by those in the criminal justice system. Now, police are trained extensively in dealing with criminals, and now, though, police academies have begun devoting greater time and attention to training officers on how to communicate with victims. So, and along with that, maybe having support groups, the movement towards crime victims' rights, and we don't really have time to go over that historical view, but the Crime Victims' Rights Act of 2004, part of the largest Justice for All Act of 2004, states that a crime victim has several different rights, and there's about 8 of them, and those are listed on page 111 in your textbook. And then programs and services for crime victims, whether it be through the police department or the DA's office, and the police role. What is our role when it comes to dealing with crime victims? Well, the first and all-important contract between the police and a victim, or contact between the police and a victim, is made during the preliminary investigation. So police officers must be realistic with victims and do the best they can to support whatever investigation that they are actually going through. And then finally, and I went just a little bit over, so I apologize, there is a kind of a document or a picture up on your screen that's called the leaky net, and basically this refers to crimes committed, and as you look at this, you can see the funneling or shrinkage of the leaky net as you start to go down in the amount of individuals that perhaps don't report crime, or crimes that are not responded to, or criminals that are not arrested, and you can go all the way down to the bottom where you can see criminals who actually repay their victims. So again, kind of an interesting look at victimization and how we could probably do better at things like that. So I know that was long and I had to kind of hurry through. I did want to end with this last slide, though, to show you that I know that sometimes people think that, you know what, law enforcement officers cannot be the victims of crimes, but actually they can. And this chart will kind of show you that there have been fewer officer deaths overall, but more in 2016 comparatively, and officers may be assaulted or killed. Most often they are secondary victims, meaning that they're not looked at as a victim, but they truly are. And it is a tough business to be into, so you should at least know this information as well. So, okay, so with that being said, I know again it was a long one. I apologize, went over a little bit. That's going to conclude our Chapter 3 lecture. If you have any questions, please post them on the discussion board or feel free to email me. And again, reminder, look at the terms, especially in the front of your chapters to help you with your quizzes and your exams. With that being said, until next time.